The war in Ukraine and global inflation have proved to be a deadly combination for the oil industry. Prices have remained high and the supply continues to be slashed. The world's major oil exporters have now agreed to cut production by 2 million barrels a day. That is around 2% of the global oil supply. Now, OPEC Plus says the decision will come into effect from next month, but global markets have already turned bloody. Stock prices of oil firms have skyrocketed. It is the biggest cut in oil production since the height of the COVID pandemic in 2020. There are fears that it could fuel inflation further and central banks might be pushed into hiking interest rates even more. OPEC Plus is a grouping of 23 oil exporting countries. They together decide the price of crude oil on the world market. What is tricky in today's climate is that Russia is part of the bloc, and Russia alone produces over 10 million barrels of oil a day. Moscow is already facing the brunt of its invasion of Ukraine. Many countries are avoiding buying oil from Russia. For months now, the US is trying to walk the geopolitical tightrope. The country has repeatedly asked OPEC Plus not to go ahead with the cuts in its oil production, partly because lower prices would mean less revenue for Russia. Washington and London even tried to sway Saudi Arabia and the UAE into not raising their oil prices. The White House has gone as far as to accuse the OPEC Plus grouping of aligning with Russia. But it seems these allegations and criticisms have fallen on deaf ears. OPEC Plus still went ahead with the production cuts, and it's not as if there are no buyers for Russian oil. Remember, India and China have decided to circumvent Western sanctions on Moscow. Now, these two countries account for over half of Russia's seaborne exports. So oil has become just another bone of contention for Moscow and Washington. And like the war itself, it is impacting even those who have nothing to do with the issue. For more on this big story, we are now joined by Wojciech Jacobi, who is an energy analyst in Poland. Mr. Jacobi, thanks so much for speaking to WION. Now, the world's major oil exporters, the OPEC Plus bloc, has decided to cut oil production by 2 million barrels a day. As we said, that's 2% of the global oil supply. It's the biggest cut in oil production since the height of the COVID pandemic, and one that is likely to fuel inflation further around the globe. And considering that Russia alone produces over 10 million barrels of oil a day, but is currently facing major Western sanctions, the US and the UK have said OPEC Plus has taken this controversial decision primarily to help Russia. Is that how this is being widely viewed? What rationale has been offered by the grouping for this decision at a time when the global energy crisis is snowballing by the day?
So the petrostates are fighting for their earnings, which are record high because of the windfall profits coming from the energy crunch, from undersupply of oil all over the world. So the OPEC Plus countries, including Russia, Saudi Arabia, are fighting for their earnings. They are looking to increase the oil price in spite of undersupply, and they will hit the importer countries, including China or India, when it comes to their GDP, because the oil price is connected to the fuel prices on the market. So that is how they will defend their earnings, but in the meantime they will fuel the economic crisis all over the world.
Well, there is no doubt that the economic crisis all over the world is worsening by the day. It's not just in Europe, but even countries that really have nothing to do with the war are facing the brunt of it. You know, we talked about India and China deciding to circumvent Western sanctions on Moscow. These two countries now together account for over half of Russia's seaborne exports. And now this contentious move by OPEC Plus to cut their oil production, do you believe, keeping in mind this changed scenario, oil is now unmistakably the new war zone between Moscow and the West? And how do you see this playing out in the weeks and months ahead? And how do you see it impacting the world at large?
So in general, we'll see further demand destruction when it comes to oil. Countries in the West are limiting themselves because the prices are so high that without any restrictions, they are limiting usage of fossil fuels because they are so expensive. another energy crisis like it was in 70s in 20th century will make West less dependent, but it takes time. So after this long and hard winter, it will get better. There is also a possibility that economic crisis all over the world will limit the demand on oil and will have another oil price crash like it was in 2020 when there was COVID restrictions all over the world and no one wanted this oil. So that is one of the arguments behind this OPEC Plus decision to keep the supply limited. It could be a sign that OPEC Plus is predicting a huge economic crisis all over the world, not only in the West.
Absolutely. In fact, there are now economists who are warning of a major global recession, not just a slowdown. And that is a huge worry. They say it could be far worse than what we saw in 2008. Given, the current circumstances, how harsh do you think the coming winter is likely to be, given that the energy crisis is really snowballing by the day? Even countries like the UK are right now grappling with it in a big way.
So we all need to limit ourselves because the supplies are limited and OPEC Plus it's not helping with these limitations. So we'll need to ration the supplies. I mean to somehow control it. We'll see a greater role from the state actors. We see it in European Union. We see it in different places. You see that Pakistan, for example, is looking for LNG supplies and it cannot find it anywhere. We'll see situations like this, and only some new global solutions could bring us some positive results. But we need cooperation to achieve that, and we don't see this cooperation. We as the West are asking other countries to cooperate to contain Russia on one hand, but to provide supplies from different alternative sources on the other. There is no resolution yet.
There's no resolution yet, and it is really no surprise that you actually now have countries like the UK and US almost wooing Saudi Arabia and the UAE for those countries' oil, given the tensions with Russia and, of course, the punishing sanctions that have been imposed on Moscow. But this winter, certainly, it looks like is going to be a very, very harsh one for Europe and indeed for the rest of the world. Mr. Yacobi, thank you so much for speaking to WION and sharing your perspective with us on that crucial story.